There is a city at the center of the world, not geographically, of course, but in the imagination of the medieval mind, in the prayers whispered at dawn, in the dreams of kings and peasants alike. There was one place that mattered above all others, a city of white stone and golden light, sitting on a limestone plateau between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. A city where, depending on who you asked, God had walked, prophets had spoken, and heaven itself had briefly touched the earth. Jerusalem. For over 2 centuries, from the closing years of the 11th century to the twilight of the 13th, the fate of that city would send armies marching across thousands of miles of desert and sea. It would consume the lives of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. It would topple dynasties, forge new ones, and reshape the map of the known world. And it would leave behind a legacy so complicated, so layered with glory and atrocity, that historians are still quietly arguing about it today. This is the story of the Crusades. At its most essential, the Crusades were a series of religious military campaigns launched primarily by Western European Christians, Catholic Christians, loyal to the Pope in Rome, with the declared goal of recovering the Holy Land from Muslim rule. There were 8 major crusades in total, though scholars debate the precise count, along with dozens of smaller campaigns, sieges, and expeditions that don't fit neatly into any numbered list. The largest and most consequential ran from 1095 to 1291, nearly 200 years of almost continuous conflict. But to call them simply a war misses something important. The Crusades were a war, yes. They were also a pilgrimage, a political movement, a commercial enterprise, a demographic catastrophe, and, depending on the era and the actor, an act of profound faith and profound savagery, sometimes within the same week, sometimes within the same man. The men and women at the heart of this story are extraordinary by almost any measure. There is Pope Urban II, the quietly brilliant churchman who in 1095 stood before a crowd at Clermont, France, and delivered a sermon that would change the course of history. A call to arms so compelling that the crowd reportedly erupted with a single voice: Deus vult. God wills it. There is Godfrey of Bouillon, the solemn Belgian duke, who led his forces all the way to Jerusalem on the First Crusade, and, when the city finally fell, refused to be crowned king. For he would not, he said, wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. There is Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the Kurdish general who would become Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who would recapture Jerusalem in 1187 with a discipline and mercy that stunned even his enemies, and who would come to be admired across both the Islamic and Christian worlds as something approaching an ideal of chivalric virtue. There is Richard the High of England, Richard the Lionheart, fierce, charismatic, perhaps the finest battlefield commander of his age, who spent virtually his entire reign away from England and met Saladin in a contest of arms and will that has never quite lost its romantic shimmer. There is Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, who accomplished what armies could not, negotiating the return of Jerusalem through diplomacy rather than bloodshed, and was excommunicated by the Pope for doing it. And there are thousands upon thousands of others, nobles and peasants, merchants and monks, Byzantine emperors watching warily from Constantinople, assassins operating from mountain fortresses in Syria, Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, those strange hybrid orders of soldier monks who would become among the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. The battles they fought have names that still carry weight: the Siege of Antioch, the Fall of Jerusalem, the Battle of Hattin, where Saladin broke the back of the Crusader kingdoms in a single devastating afternoon, the Siege of Acre, which the Crusaders starved and bled for 2 years to retake, Damietta, Le Forby, the walls of Constantinople, sacked not by Muslims but by the Crusaders themselves in one of history's most embarrassing and destructive betrayals. What you are about to hear is not a story with clean heroes and clear villains. It is a story about human beings under impossible pressures, religious, political, economic, emotional, making decisions that seemed rational in their moment and catastrophic in hindsight. It is a story about faith wielded as a weapon, about courage and cruelty walking hand in hand across the desert sand. It is, in short, the kind of story that the ancient world was very good at producing, and that we have never quite stopped telling. So settle in. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. And it begins, as so many long roads do, with a single voice calling out across a cold November crowd, asking people to believe that God Himself had work for them to do. To understand why hundreds of thousands of people would leave their homes, their families, their fields and workshops and comfortable obscurities, and march toward a city most of them had never seen and could barely picture. You first have to understand the world they were leaving behind. The Europe of the late 11th century is not a world that most of us would recognize. There are no nations in the modern sense. No France, not really. No Germany. No unified Italy. What exists instead is a vast, decentralized patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and city-states, all loosely stitched together by two great organizing forces, the Catholic Church and the feudal system. One governed the soul. The other governed almost everything else. The feudal system, in its simplest form, was a pyramid of obligation. At the top sat kings. Below them, the great lords, dukes and counts who had sworn loyalty in exchange for land. Below them, the lesser nobles and knights who owed military service in exchange for their own smaller holdings. And at the very bottom, doing the actual work of feeding everyone, the peasantry, bound to the land, bound to their lord, bound to a life of labor that left very little room for anything resembling personal ambition or spiritual adventure. It was, for the vast majority of people, a hard life, a short life. Disease moved through villages without warning or mercy. Famines came with quiet regularity. Violence, between lords, between kingdoms, between neighbors, was not exceptional. It was structural. It was simply part of the texture of existence. And yet within this hard world burned something that is difficult for the modern mind to fully appreciate, an absolutely consuming religious faith. This is not faith as a private matter, tucked away for Sundays. This is faith as the entire architecture of reality. Medieval Christians did not believe in heaven and hell the way some people today believe in, say, an afterlife. As a vague and comforting possibility, they believed in it the way they believed in the ground beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. It was simply, completely, undeniably there. And the consequence of that belief was that everything, every decision, every suffering, every joy, carried cosmic weight. Your soul was always at stake. The priests reminded you of this regularly. The church reminded you of this in stone and glass and candlelight, in the soaring architecture of cathedrals designed specifically to make you feel small and heaven feel close. Into this world, two things had been slowly building for decades before anyone said the word crusade. The first was the question of the Holy Land itself. Jerusalem had been under Muslim rule since 637 AD, over 4 centuries before the First Crusade. When Arab armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and transformed the ancient world with a speed and totality that astonished everyone, including, arguably, the Arabs themselves. For most of those 4 centuries, Christian pilgrims had been able to travel to Jerusalem without enormous difficulty. The Fatimid Caliphate, which controlled the region through much of the 10th and 11th centuries, was generally tolerant of Christian visitors, and the pilgrim trade was, among other things, economically useful. Tensions existed, certainly. There were episodes of persecution and violence, but the Holy Land was not, for most of this period, a place from which Christians were barred. What changed everything was the arrival of the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a Turkic people from the steppes of Central Asia who had converted to Sunni Islam and, in the mid-11th century, began expanding westward with extraordinary military force. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, a name that still carries a particular gravity in Byzantine history, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan defeated the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV so completely that Romanos himself was taken prisoner on the battlefield. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe for the Christian East. The Seljuks poured into Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, and within a generation had taken territory that Byzantium had held for centuries. They also took Jerusalem, and under Seljuk rule, the situation for Christian pilgrims deteriorated significantly. Access became dangerous. Reports filtered back to Europe, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, of pilgrims being robbed, harassed, killed, of holy sites being desecrated, of Christians in the East suffering under a new and less accommodating power. Whether all of these reports were entirely true is, to some extent, beside the point. What matters is that they were believed. The second building pressure was internal to the church itself, and it was a crisis of an entirely different kind. For decades, the papacy had been engaged in a bitter struggle with the secular rulers of Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Emperors, over a question that sounds almost bureaucratic but was, in practice, explosive: who had the right to appoint bishops and church officials. This was the investiture controversy, and it had consumed enormous political energy, produced genuine schisms, and left the church in a state of institutional anxiety about its own authority and relevance. The papacy that emerged from this struggle, and particularly the Reformed papacy of the late 11th century, was more assertive, more centralized, and more politically ambitious than it had been in generations. It was also deeply aware that it needed something to unite the fractious, chronically warring nobility of Europe behind a single, unifying purpose. The knights and lords of the feudal system were, from the church's perspective, an almost unmanageable problem. They fought constantly, not just against external enemies but against each other, in private wars and feuds that devastated the peasantry and undermined social order. The church had tried various mechanisms to restrain this violence: the peace of God, the truce of God, proclamations forbidding warfare on certain days, in certain places, against certain people. None of it worked particularly well. What if, instead of trying to suppress the violence of the warrior class, you gave it somewhere to go? This, stripped of all its theological dressing, was one of the quiet political calculations behind what Pope Urban II announced at Clermont in November of 1095. Not the only calculation, not even the primary one perhaps. Urban was a man of genuine faith, and the suffering of Eastern Christians was a real concern to him. But the idea that a foreign military enterprise might simultaneously relieve pressure in Europe, reunite the Eastern and Western churches, and restore the papacy's prestige, that idea was not absent from the room. There is also a third element that rarely gets its due in the grand narratives of religious zeal and political calculation, and that is simple human restlessness. The 11th century in Western Europe was, in certain respects, a moment of population growth, of land pressure, of younger sons who would inherit nothing under the rules of primogeniture and had to find their fortune elsewhere. The Crusade offered something genuinely rare in medieval life: movement, purpose, the possibility of land, of wealth, of glory, in this world and the next. For a knight with no inheritance and a sword he had no particular place to use, the call to march east was not purely spiritual. It was also an opportunity. This is not cynicism. It is simply the recognition that human beings are complex and that the most powerful historical movements are almost always driven by a braided rope of motives. Some noble, some practical, some barely conscious, that cannot be cleanly separated into the sincere and the self-interested. The people who answered Pope Urban's call at Clermont and in the months that followed were not, most of them, cynics. They wept when they heard the sermon. They sewed crosses onto their tunics with their own hands. They said goodbye to people they would never see again with a faith that is, even at this distance, genuinely moving. They believed, most of them, entirely and without reservation, that they were doing God's work. Whether God agreed is not a question historians are equipped to answer. What we can say is this: by the spring of 1096, the roads of Europe were filling with people heading east. Some were great lords with armies at their backs. Some were peasants with nothing but a walking stick and a prayer. Some were criminals hoping a crusading vow might wash their records clean. Some were genuinely devout. Some were genuinely desperate. Many were both. They had no reliable maps, no supply lines, no clear understanding of the distance involved, or the terrain, or the enemies they would face. Many of them, particularly among the early and disorganized waves of common people who left before the armies were ready, would die before they ever saw the walls of Constantinople, let alone Jerusalem. And yet they went. Because the world had told them, in every sermon and every stone cathedral, and every illuminated manuscript they had ever encountered, that Jerusalem was the center of everything. And centers, when they are threatened, have a way of pulling everything toward them. The first thing you need to understand about the First Crusade is that there were actually two of them, not officially. Not in the history books, where the First Crusade is assigned its tidy dates of 1096 to 1099 and its tidy narrative arc from Clermont to Jerusalem. But in practice, in the lived and often terrible reality of what actually happened on those roads heading east, there were two very distinct movements that both called themselves Crusades, both wore the cross, and both departed within months of each other. One of them is the story people tend to remember, the story of knights and sieges and eventual, agonizing triumph. The other is a story that history has spent considerable energy quietly setting aside, and it begins not with armored lords on horseback, but with a barefoot preacher and an enormous, chaotic, largely unarmed crowd of ordinary people heading east at entirely the wrong time of year, for entirely the wrong reasons, with no plan at all. His name was Peter the Hermit, and by any measure he was one of the more remarkable figures the 11th century produced. He was small, apparently, physically unprepossessing, riding a donkey rather than a warhorse, but he possessed that rare and dangerous gift of being able to make any crowd that heard him feel, in the moment of hearing, that the entire shape of the universe had just clicked into focus. He had possibly attempted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem before and been turned back. He had certainly suffered, and he had the preacher's instinct for translating personal suffering into collective grievance, and collective grievance into collective action. By the spring of 1096, Peter had gathered around him a force that historians have called the People's Crusade, and the name captures something important about both its nature and its limitations. These were not trained soldiers. These were farmers, minor clergy, women, children, elderly pilgrims, petty criminals, and somewhere among them, a scattering of genuine minor knights. Their numbers were large, perhaps 40,000 in total, though estimates vary wildly. Their military capability was almost negligible. Their enthusiasm was absolute. They set off from the Rhine Valley in the spring, and almost immediately, catastrophe began. Before they had even left Europe, before they had crossed a single hostile frontier, Significant elements of this crowd turned on Jewish communities in the Rhine Valley and massacred them. The reasons were a vicious tangle of religious hatred, economic resentment, and the terrifying mob logic that takes hold when large numbers of frightened people have been told that they are soldiers of God and that the enemies of God deserve death. The communities of Worms, Mainz, and Cologne suffered devastating violence. Thousands died. Local bishops tried to offer protection and were largely overwhelmed. It is important to pause here because this is not a footnote. These pogroms, among the worst that European Jewish communities had yet experienced, were not a side effect of the crusading movement. They were, in a grim and direct way, a product of it. The same rhetoric that called Christian Europe to war against the Muslim world also provided justification, in the minds of some, for violence against the Jewish communities living in their midst. The Crusades did not invent European anti-Semitism, but they amplified it and gave it organized, murderous momentum. That shadow falls across the entire history that follows. Peter's People's Crusade staggered through the Balkans, alternately welcomed and attacked by local populations, exhausted by the passage of this vast, hungry, undisciplined column. By the time they reached Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, the man who had originally appealed to the Pope for military help against the Seljuks, looked at what had arrived on his doorstep and felt something approaching horror. This was not what he had asked for. Alexios had envisioned a manageable force of Western mercenary knights who would help him recover Byzantine territory from the Seljuks, soldiers he could direct, control, and deploy strategically. What he received first was this: a vast, starving, undisciplined mob that immediately began looting the suburbs of his capital. He got them across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible, urged them to wait for the real armies that were coming, and watched with resigned dismay as they marched directly into Seljuk territory without waiting for anything. Near Sivatat, in October of 1096, the Seljuks met them. It was not a battle. It was closer to a massacre. The Turkish forces were professional soldiers, experienced and disciplined. Peter's followers were almost entirely untrained, poorly armed, and had walked for months across hostile terrain on insufficient food. The slaughter was extensive. Those who survived were largely taken into slavery. Peter himself survived only because he happened to be back at Constantinople when the attack came. The People's Crusade was over. It had traveled thousands of miles, committed atrocities against the innocent, suffered its own annihilation, and achieved nothing at all, except perhaps to harden the resolve of the proper armies that were still assembling back in Europe. Those armies arrived at Constantinople in waves through the winter and spring of 1096 and 1097, and they were a genuinely formidable thing. The princes who led them were among the most capable military men in Europe. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, steady and deeply pious, leading a Frankish contingent from what is now Belgium and northern France. There was his brother Baldwin, sharper, more politically agile, with ambitions that would eventually exceed the crusade itself. There was Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman from southern Italy, tall and charismatic and possessed of a military brilliance that his contemporaries found both admirable and slightly frightening. There was Raymond of Toulouse, old and enormously wealthy, who had taken the cross with a fervor that seemed to border on the mystical. And there was the papal legate, Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Pope's representative on the campaign, a man of genuine wisdom and diplomatic skill, who would prove to be one of the Crusade's most stabilizing forces for as long as he lived. Together, these men commanded somewhere between 50 and 100,000 soldiers. The exact numbers are impossible to recover with any confidence, along with a vast train of non-combatants, pilgrims and servants. It was one of the largest military expeditions Western Europe had ever assembled. Alexios received them with careful diplomacy and considerable private anxiety. He extracted oaths from most of the leaders that any former Byzantine territory they recovered would be returned to the empire. Whether he genuinely expected those oaths to be honored is a question his own correspondence answers with quiet ambiguity. In May of 1097, the combined force crossed into Anatolia and began to move. Their first major objective was Nishaya, the Seljuk capital in Anatolia, and a city of enormous strategic importance. The siege of Nishaya lasted roughly 7 weeks, a methodical, grinding affair that ended with a small diplomatic embarrassment when Alexios negotiated the city's surrender directly with the Seljuk garrison, allowing them to capitulate to Byzantine forces rather than be sacked by the Crusaders. The soldiers who had expected plunder were not entirely pleased. But Nicaea fell, and the column moved on. The next encounter was a genuine battle, and it nearly ended everything. At Dorylaeum, in July of 1097, the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan caught the crusading army on the march and hit the vanguard, led by Bohemond, with a cavalry assault that was fast, overwhelming, and very nearly fatal. The Seljuk style of warfare was alien to most of the Western knights. These were horse archers, endlessly mobile, who attacked in waves and retreated before close combat could be forced upon them, drawing the enemy forward, disrupting formation, wearing down morale with arrows that came from directions that didn't quite make sense. The Crusader vanguard held, barely, while Bohemond sent desperate messages to the commanders behind him. What saved them was essentially raw size. The main body of the army arrived in time, hit the Seljuk forces from the flank, and the combination of mass and the shot power of the Western heavy cavalry, which at close quarters was devastating, eventually broke the Turkish assault. Kilij Arslan withdrew. The road through Anatolia was open, but the road was terrible. The summer heat of the Anatolian plateau was something that almost none of these men had experienced before. Horses died in enormous numbers. Food ran short. Men collapsed on the march from heat and thirst and illness. Baldwin of Boulogne detached from the main force at some point during this march, heading east with a small contingent, nominally to secure the Crusades' flank, but in practice to pursue his own interests. He would end up in the Armenian city of Edessa, where he would be adopted by the childless Armenian ruler, and subsequently, in circumstances that remain diplomatically opaque, take power himself. The first Crusader state had been born, almost as an afterthought, from the ambitions of a younger son with nowhere else to be. The main army, meanwhile, pressed south toward a city that would test them more severely than anything they had faced yet. A city of immense walls, ancient towers, and a garrison that had absolutely no intention of surrendering. Antioch, and the siege that followed would push the crusade to the very edge of collapse before something happened, something that to some was a miracle and to others was a very well-timed lie, that pulled it back from the brink and sent it, bloodied and half-mad with exhaustion and faith, toward Jerusalem. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the slow, grinding accumulation of days, of weeks, of months in which nothing improves, in which the horizon never changes, in which the human body and the human spirit are worn down not by one great wound, but by 10,000 small ones. Hunger, disease, cold, heat, fear, and the creeping, corrosive suspicion that God may have forgotten where you are. The Crusaders who arrived before the walls of Antioch in October of 197 were about to learn what that kind of suffering felt like, and they were going to spend 8 months learning it. Antioch was, by any military assessment, a forbidding target. Situated in what is now southern Turkey, near the Syrian border, the city occupied a position of extraordinary natural strength. To the south and west, the Orontes River. To the east, the steep slopes of Mount Silpius rising almost directly from the city walls. The walls themselves were among the most formidable in the medieval world. roughly 12 miles in circumference, punctuated by 400 towers, thick enough and high enough that any direct assault without proper siege equipment would be not just difficult, but suicidal. The garrison inside was large, well supplied, and commanded by a capable Turkish governor named Yagi Siyan, who had spent the months of the Crusaders' approach preparing his defenses with considerable care. He had also, with a pragmatism that says something about the complicated human geography of the region, expelled the city's Christian population, fearing, not unreasonably, that they might open a gate from the inside. Their expulsion was brutal. Some were killed, others fled into the surrounding countryside and died of exposure. The Christian communities of Antioch, who had lived there for generations, were simply discarded as a military liability. The Crusader army that settled around the city's gates was already weakened from the march across Anatolia. Their numbers had been reduced by battle, disease, and desertion. Their horses, crucial for cavalry warfare, had been devastated by the summer campaign. They were short of food almost immediately, in a region that had been systematically stripped of provisions by the retreating Seljuks. And winter was coming. The decision not to storm the walls, which would have been catastrophic, and to lay siege instead, was strategically sound. But a siege of Antioch presented its own nearly impossible set of problems. The city was simply too large to be surrounded completely with the forces available. Supply lines into the city from the north remained partially open for months, allowing Yagi Siyan to resupply and reinforce, while the Crusaders outside slowly starved. Because starvation is precisely what began to happen. The army that had arrived with reasonable provisions found those provisions exhausted within weeks. Foraging parties went out and came back with less than they needed, sometimes with nothing, sometimes not at all. Horses were eaten, then the horses were gone. Pack animals went next. Men began dying not from Turkish arrows, but from simple, quiet malnutrition, from the illnesses that follow malnutrition, from the cold that winter brought down from the mountains without mercy or apology. Desertion became a serious problem. Men slipped away in the night, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups. Among those who left was a figure who would become a particular object of contempt in the chronicles, Stephen of Blois, a nobleman of considerable rank who departed the siege, wrote home to his wife that the campaign was essentially hopeless, and advised her not to worry because he was coming back. He was wrong on both counts. His wife, Adela, reportedly a more formidable personality than her husband, sent him back to the crusade. The chronicles record his return with a certain satisfaction. Even Bohemond, the most militarily gifted of the commanders, spoke openly at council meetings about the possibility that the enterprise might fail. This was not defeatism. It was an honest assessment of conditions that were, by any rational measure, extremely bad. And yet, the army stayed. This is one of the genuinely remarkable facts about the First Crusade. Not that it eventually succeeded, but that it survived the siege of Antioch at all. Some combination of religious conviction, group identity, logistical inability to simply leave, fear of what retreat would mean, and the stubborn refusal of the strongest commanders to accept the obvious, kept the army outside those walls through a winter that killed enormous numbers of them. Relief came in partial, complicated forms. A Genoese fleet arrived at the nearby port of St. Simeon with supplies and, crucially, skilled craftsmen capable of building siege equipment. Byzantine and Armenian forces in the region provided some assistance. A Crusader victory over a relieving Turkish army at the Battle of the Lake in February of 1098 bought time and improved morale. Conditions remained dire, but the army was still there, still intact, still, incredibly, besieging. And Bohemond had been making other arrangements. Inside Antioch, a man named Firuz, an Armenian convert to Islam who commanded 3 of the city's towers, had developed grievances against Yagi Siyan that are variously attributed to a dispute over money, a personal insult, or some deeper disillusionment with his situation, Bohemond made contact. Negotiations proceeded with the delicate care that treachery always requires. And Bohemond, characteristically, extracted a price before agreeing to anything. He told the other Crusade leaders that he had a way into the city. He would share it, but only if, when Antioch fell, he was granted lordship over the city himself. The other leaders, exhausted and desperate, eventually agreed, with the caveat that the agreement would be void if the Byzantine emperor arrived to claim the city first. Alexios, as it happened, was indeed marching south with a relief force. He would turn back before reaching Antioch, advised by the deserter Stephen of Blois that the situation was hopeless. A piece of intelligence that was, by the time it was delivered, already outdated. The irony of it is considerable. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond's men climbed ropes lowered from Firouz's towers. The gates were opened. The Crusaders poured into Antioch and, in the hours that followed, committed a massacre of its Muslim and some of its Jewish population, with an efficiency born of months of accumulated fury and starvation. Yagi Sion fled the city in the chaos and was caught and killed by local Armenians before the sun was properly up. Antioch had fallen, and almost immediately the situation reversed itself with a black comedic timing that must have felt to the men inside those walls like a divine joke. 3 days after the Crusaders took Antioch, a massive Seljuk relief army under the command of Kerboka, Atabeg of Mosul, an army that had been assembling for weeks while the siege dragged on, arrived outside the city. Now the Crusaders were inside Antioch, and the Seljuks were outside it. The besiegers had become the besieged. The situation was, by any sober military analysis, extremely grave. The army inside Antioch was weakened, undersupplied, exhausted from months of siege, followed by a night assault, followed by a massacre. The force outside was fresh, large, and commanded by an experienced general. Desertion resumed, with men lowering themselves over the walls at night rather than face what seemed like inevitable defeat. Morale, which had briefly soared with the capture of the city, collapsed back toward despair with a speed that told its own story about how thin the margin of hope had become. It was into this darkness that a man named Peter Bartholomew arrived with a vision. Peter was a low-ranking pilgrim, exactly the kind of person the noble commanders would normally have paid very little attention to. But what he claimed to have received was not something that could be easily dismissed. He said that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a dream and revealed the location buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Antioch, of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. The leadership received this claim with varying degrees of skepticism. The papal legate at Hemar, a careful and experienced man, was privately doubtful. But the timing was too desperate and the potential too enormous to ignore. An excavation was organized. Peter himself, after hours of digging by others, descended into the pit and almost immediately produced an iron spearhead. Whether it was genuinely ancient, whether it had been planted there in advance, whether Peter Bartholomew was a visionary or a very well-intentioned fraud, these questions were debated then and have been debated ever since. What is not debatable is the effect it had on the army. The discovery of the Holy Lance, real or otherwise, transformed the psychological atmosphere inside Antioch almost overnight. Something that had been flickering toward extinction was suddenly, powerfully rekindled. Historians can describe the mechanism, the need for divine affirmation in a moment of crisis, the way shared belief systems can produce genuine collective emotional transformation. But even the most secular account has to acknowledge that what happened next is not entirely explicable by rational military analysis alone. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders opened the gates of Antioch and marched out to face Kerboka's army. They were outnumbered. They were weakened. Some accounts describe their leaders marching barefoot as an act of penance, and they carried among them, borne in procession, the lance. Kerboga, for reasons that historians still debate, insufficient coordination among his subordinate commanders, a miscalculation about Crusader weakness, overconfidence, political tensions within his own coalition, failed to destroy them when he had the chance. The Crusader force held its formation, pressed forward, and the Turkish army, instead of pressing its enormous numerical advantage, began to fragment and withdraw. The battle ended not with a climactic last stand, but with something stranger, a collapse of will in the larger army, a dissolution, a retreat that became a rout. Kerboga was gone, Antioch was secure, and the road to Jerusalem was, finally, open. The army that set off southward in the months that followed was smaller than the one that had left Constantinople. It was harder, leaner, and marked in ways that don't show up in chronicles, by what it had seen, what it had done, and what it had endured. It moved with the particular grim purpose of people who have already paid more than they expected and are not going to stop until the account is settled. Jerusalem waited. 3 months' march to the south, and Jerusalem, when they arrived, would give them the reckoning they had come for. Travelers have remarked on it for centuries. Something to do with the altitude, the pale limestone of the buildings, the way the sun hits the hills at certain hours and turns everything a shade of gold that seems almost deliberate, almost designed to make the place feel chosen. The Crusaders who crested the ridge northwest of the city in June of 1099 and saw it for the first time would not have had the language of optics or atmospheric science to explain what they were looking at. They had something else instead. They fell to their knees. The chronicles describe it uniformly: men weeping, men praying, men removing their shoes to walk on ground they considered holy even at this distance. 3 years, thousands of miles. Nicaea and Dorylaeum and the slow starvation outside Antioch, and the lance and the bodies of friends left in the ground across half a continent. And now, finally, there it was, the city they had been promised. What they saw, through their tears and their exhaustion, was a formidably walled city, sitting on a limestone plateau, its defenses in good repair, its garrison alert and prepared, its population swelled with refugees from the surrounding countryside who had fled the approaching army. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had taken the precaution of expelling the city's Christian population, much as Yagi Sion had done at Antioch, and had poisoned or blocked the wells outside the walls. He had, by the military standards of the time, done nearly everything right. The Crusaders who surrounded Jerusalem numbered somewhere around 13,000 fighting men, a fraction of the force that had left Constantinople 2 years earlier. They had no significant siege equipment. They were desperately short of water in the July heat of the Judean hills, and they had arrived with the urgent knowledge that a Fatimid relief army was assembling in Egypt and moving north toward them. Time was not a luxury they possessed. The first assault, launched on June the 13th, barely days after arrival, before proper preparations had been made, was repulsed with relative ease. The defenders fought from the walls with arrows, Greek fire, and the considerable advantage of elevation, and the Crusaders below, without adequate siege equipment, could not get men to the top of those walls in sufficient numbers to matter. They fell back, they regrouped, and they confronted the uncomfortable arithmetic of their situation. To take Jerusalem They needed siege towers. To build siege towers, they needed timber, and the hills around Jerusalem, overgrazed, sun-scorched, stripped by centuries of habitation, had almost none. What saved them, again, was the sea. A small fleet of Genoese and English ships had arrived at the port of Jaffa, carrying not soldiers but materials and skilled craftsmen. Timber was sourced from the forests of Samaria, transported to the siege lines on the backs of men and the remaining animals, and the army's engineers, working with a focused urgency that the approaching Egyptian relief army made very concrete, began constructing 2 great siege towers and an array of supporting equipment. The work took approximately 6 weeks. During those weeks, the army suffered in the summer heat, rationed water so severely that horses and men were dying of thirst, and endured the psychological pressure of knowing that a relief army was coming and that the window for success was finite and closing. A priest named Peter Desiderius, connected to the same visionary tradition as Peter Bartholomew, reported a vision instructing the army to fast, pray, and march barefoot in procession around the walls of the city, in the manner of Joshua before Jericho. On July 8, 1099, the entire army did exactly this, marching in barefoot procession around Jerusalem's walls, while the garrison above them watched, and occasionally jeered, and displayed crucifixes over the ramparts in deliberate desecration. The chronicles record that the Crusaders completed their circuit in silence and prayer. They then climbed the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit preached, and Raymond of Aguilers, the army's chaplain, led the assembled soldiers in prayers that the accounts describe as accompanied by collective weeping. Whether the ceremony genuinely stiffened their resolve or simply provided an emotional release that happened to coincide with the moment when preparations were finally complete, is, again, the kind of question that resists a clean answer. 5 days later, on the night of July 13th, the siege towers began to move. The final assault on Jerusalem is one of those historical events that has been told so many times, in so many registers, triumphant, horrified, analytical, devotional, that extracting what actually happened from what people wished had happened requires a certain careful patience. What actually happened was this. 2 siege towers were moved against the walls in the pre-dawn darkness. One, on the south side of the city near the Zion Gate, was commanded by Raymond of Toulouse and made some initial progress before stalling. The other, on the north side, was under the overall direction of Godfrey of Bouillon, and it was here that the assault ultimately broke through. The fighting on the wall-tops was close, vicious, and decided by margins of chance and courage so fine that the outcome could plausibly have gone the other way. Defenders poured fire and stones and arrows down on the men in the towers and on the scaling ladders. The towers themselves were set alight at various points during the battle and had to be extinguished while fighting continued around them. Then, on the afternoon of July 15th, 1099, a Friday, a detail the chronicles note with theological satisfaction, a Flemish knight named Letold became the first crusader to gain the wall. Godfrey of Bouillon followed. Others came behind them, and the defenders who had held the ramparts for days broke under the pressure of men coming over the top of the wall, while more pressed through a gate that had been opened in the confusion. The city fell. What followed is the part of the story that no amount of historical context makes easy to sit with. The sack of Jerusalem lasted approximately 2 days, and it was, by the contemporary accounts of the Crusaders themselves, an act of comprehensive massacre. The Muslim population of the city, men, women, and children who had surrendered or attempted to surrender, were killed in numbers that the chronicles describe without apparent discomfort and sometimes with explicit satisfaction. The Jewish population, who had taken refuge in the main synagogue, were burned alive when the building was set on fire. Raymond of Aguilers, the army chaplain who was present, wrote that in the Temple Mount area the blood of the slain reached the knees of men and the bridles of horses. Modern historians consider this figure almost certainly an exaggeration, a rhetorical flourish borrowed from apocalyptic literature. The actual death toll, while impossible to verify precisely, was unambiguously enormous. The city's civilian population was, in the most straightforward terms, largely murdered. The Crusaders who participated in this massacre did not, in the main, experience it as a contradiction of their faith. They experienced it as its fulfillment. The liberation of Jerusalem was, in the theological framework they inhabited, a divine act, and the destruction of those who had held it, an act of justice on God's behalf. Raymond of Aguilar's wrote of it with something approaching ecstasy. Godfrey of Bouillon, having helped storm the walls, went barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and wept. The capacity of human beings to hold these two things simultaneously, genuine devotion and genuine atrocity, without experiencing the contradiction, as a contradiction is not a medieval peculiarity, it is a human one. And the Crusades, at their most uncomfortable, are partly a very long study in exactly that capacity. The aftermath of the city's fall was both practically and symbolically enormous. Godfrey of Bouillon was offered the title of King of Jerusalem and declined it, choosing instead the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. He would survive his triumph by barely a year, dying in July of 1100 under circumstances that remain medically unclear. His brother Baldwin, who had already established himself in Edessa, came south to claim the throne and took the royal title without his brother's scruples. The Fatimid relief army that had been the source of such urgency arrived approximately a month after the city fell. At the Battle of Ascalon, fought just weeks after the sack of Jerusalem, the Crusaders met them and won convincingly. The Egyptian force, apparently not expecting the speed with which Jerusalem had fallen, was caught unprepared. It was the last major military threat to the newly established kingdom for several years. The First Crusade was, by any objective assessment, an astonishing military achievement. An army that had traveled 3,000 miles, that had survived conditions that should have destroyed it multiple times, that had taken two of the most formidable fortified cities in the medieval Middle East, had accomplished precisely what it set out to accomplish. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The question that no one in the celebrating army stopped to ask, the question that the next 2 centuries would answer in blood and exhaustion, was a simple one. How do you keep it? The kingdom of Jerusalem that emerged from the First Crusade was, geographically, a slender thing, a narrow coastal strip, a handful of fortified cities, a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim and Jewish living under a thin Christian ruling class imported from thousands of miles away. It was surrounded on every side by Islamic powers that were, for the moment, fragmented and disorganized, but would not remain so forever. The Crusaders had won the city. They had not won the world around it. And the world around it was already beginning to think about what came next. History has a tendency to move from battle to battle, from siege to siege, from one dramatic military rupture to the next, and in doing so it skips over something that is, in its own quiet way, just as remarkable as any of the fighting. The Crusaders who stayed in the Holy Land after 1099, and many did stay, the ones who had made their fortunes, the ones who had nowhere better to go, the ones who had simply fallen in love with the light and the strangeness of the place, had to do something that no chronicle of holy war had quite prepared them for. They had to govern. They had to build courts and tax systems and legal codes. They had to negotiate with neighbors, manage harvests, adjudicate disputes between people who spoke 4 different languages, and prayed to God in 3 different ways. They had to figure out, in the practical and unglamorous daily grind of administration, what it actually meant to rule a kingdom carved out of someone else's world. What emerged over the next several decades was one of the most fascinating and under-examined political experiments of the medieval period. And it was considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than the simple narrative of Christian occupiers versus Muslim resistance tends to suggest. The Crusader states. At their greatest extent, there were four of them: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, occupied a long, thin ribbon of territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast and into the interior of what is now Lebanon, Syria, and northern Iraq. They were, demographically, a curiosity. The ruling class was Western European, French, Norman, Flemish, Italian, importing the feudal structures and legal customs of their homelands into an environment they only partially understood. Below them was an overwhelmingly local population: Arab and Syriac Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, Druze, and half a dozen other communities with their own languages, customs, traditions, and memories of the events of 1099 that differed considerably from those of their new rulers. The question of how these communities actually coexisted in practice is one that historians have debated with increasing nuance over the past several decades, pushing back against both the romantic and the polemical versions of the story. The romantic version, popularized in a certain kind of historical writing and several Hollywood productions, holds that the Crusader states became, over time, places of remarkable cultural tolerance and intercommunal harmony, where Christians and Muslims and Jews lived side by side in a kind of medieval multiculturalism that puts both their ancestors and their descendants to shame. The polemical version holds the opposite, that the Crusader states were simply colonial occupations maintained by violence, in which the local population lived under systematic oppression and the occasional massacre. The actual history, as actual history tends to do, sits somewhere more complicated than either of these. What is certainly true is that the Crusader rulers needed their local population. The arithmetic of governance made this unavoidable. There were never enough Western settlers to do all the farming, all the craftsmanship, all the trade that a functioning kingdom requires. Muslim and Christian peasants worked the same fields. Local merchants, Arab, Jewish, Armenian, handled much of the commerce. Syrian Christian communities, who predated the Crusader arrival by centuries, occupied important roles in the administration and the church. The famous military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, founded in the early decades of the 12th century, developed extensive networks of interaction with local communities, simply because running fortresses and hospitals in the Levant required people who knew how the Levant actually worked. The Templars deserve a particular moment of attention here, because they are among the most mythologized institutions in medieval history, and the mythology tends to obscure the genuinely interesting reality. Founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugues de Payens, the Knights Templar began as a small group of men who dedicated themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. They were given quarters near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, hence the name, and operated initially with almost no resources and a mandate that was, even by the standards of the time, a little unusual. They were simultaneously monks and soldiers, bound by religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but carrying swords and expected to use them. The paradox of the warrior monk troubled some contemporary theologians. It did not trouble Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of the 12th century, who wrote a celebrated defense of the new order, arguing that killing in defense of Christians was not merely permissible, but spiritually meritorious. It was, he suggested, a form of malicide, the killing of evil, rather than homicide. The distinction was perhaps finer than it sounds, but Bernard's endorsement gave the Templars a legitimacy that transformed them from a small and eccentric group of Jerusalem Knights into an internationally recognized institution. Within decades, the Templars had become enormously wealthy. Land donations flooded in from across Europe. Nobles who could not travel to the Holy Land but wanted to support its defense gave what they could, and what they could, accumulated over time, was considerable. The Templars developed what amounted to an early banking system, allowing pilgrims to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land, an innovation that served genuine practical needs and made the order even more financially powerful. By the mid-12th century, they were operating across virtually every kingdom in Christendom, answerable only to the Pope, richer than many monarchs, and possessed of a mystique that their own deliberate secretiveness carefully cultivated. The Hospitallers, formerly the Order of St. John, originally founded to run a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem, followed a similar trajectory, combining military and charitable functions in a way that proved extraordinarily durable. They survive, in various forms, to this day. The political structure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was, by the standards of 12th century Europe, unusually sophisticated and unusually contentious. The feudal system imported from the West was, in the Crusader states, pushed to an extreme that produced a nobility of remarkable independence and a monarchy of corresponding weakness. The great lords of the kingdom, the lords of Galilee, of Jaffa, of Sidon, of Caesarea, held their fiefs on terms that gave them enormous latitude to resist royal authority, and they exercised that latitude regularly and with enthusiasm. The High Court of Jerusalem, the body through which the nobility participated in governance, was not merely advisory. It was, in practice, a genuine check on royal power, and the kings of Jerusalem found themselves negotiating with their own vassals in ways that their counterparts in England or France would have found bewildering. This mattered enormously for the kingdom's survival, because it meant that at precisely the moments when strong, centralized leadership was most urgently needed, when the external threats were greatest, when the military situation required rapid decision and unified command, the political system tended to produce faction, delay, and the paralysis of competing interests. The succession crises that plagued Jerusalem through the 12th century were, in this light, not merely dynastic bad luck. They were the predictable product of a political system that had inadvertently made strong governance almost structurally impossible. And yet the kingdom functioned. For nearly a century after 1099, it functioned. Cities of the Crusader coast, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, became prosperous trading centers connecting the commerce of the Islamic interior to the merchant republics of Italy. Genoa, Venice, and Pisa all maintained significant communities in the Crusader ports, their merchants doing business with Muslim traders from Damascus and Cairo, with a pragmatism that the religious rhetoric of the Crusades would suggest ought to have been impossible, and that the economic incentives of the Mediterranean trade made entirely natural. Crusader castles rose across the landscape in a campaign of fortification that was, from a purely architectural standpoint, extraordinary. Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, still standing today, still capable of producing in a visitor something approaching awe, was expanded by the Hospitallers into a fortress of such sophistication that later military architects would study it as a masterwork of defensive design. Belvoir, Kerak, Montfort. The names march across the map of the Levant like a roll call of a particular kind of medieval ambition, the ambition not just to conquer, but to permanence. The people who built these castles, who planted vineyards and established markets, and wrote legal codes and had children who were born speaking Arabic as naturally as French, these people were not, whatever their origins, planning to leave. They had built a world. It was a flawed world, partial and contested and sitting on a foundation of violence that its own legal structures could not fully legitimize. But it was theirs. And in the middle decades of the 12th century, as the kingdom settled into an uneasy equilibrium between its own internal factions and the equally fractious Islamic world around it, there were moments, brief, fragile, improbable moments, that looked something like stability. Those moments would not last. Far to the north and east, in the cities of Mosul and Damascus and Cairo, something was stirring. The fragmentation that had made the First Crusade possible. The disunity of the Islamic world that had allowed a Western army to march through it and take Jerusalem almost before anyone could mount a coordinated response, was beginning, slowly, to reverse itself. A new kind of leader was emerging. Patient, ambitious, possessed of a political intelligence that could unite where others had divided. His name was Imad ad-Din Zengi, and then after him, his son Nur ad-Din, and then after him, a Kurdish general who had served in Nur ad-Din's army and would eventually surpass everything his masters had built. That general's name was Saladin, and the fragile world the Crusaders had constructed was about to meet the man it could not survive. There are figures in history who seem, in retrospect, almost too perfectly suited to their moment, as though the age itself had been quietly assembling the conditions for their arrival, stacking up the pressures and the vacuums and the accumulated failures of lesser men until the stage was ready, and then producing, with impeccable timing, exactly the person the moment required. Saladin is one of those figures. He was born around 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now Iraq, into a Kurdish family of military administrators serving the Zengid dynasty. His father, Naj ad-Din Ayub, was a capable soldier and loyal servant of the Zengid rulers. His uncle, Shirkuh, was a general of considerable ability and even more considerable appetite for food and wine, who would play a pivotal role in the early part of his nephew's career. There was nothing in Saladin's origins that obviously marked him for greatness. He was not a prince. He was not heir to any throne. He was a young man from a professional military family, in a world full of young men from professional military families. What distinguished him, as it so often does with figures of genuine historical significance, was not his starting position, but the quality of his mind, and a patience so profound that it sometimes looked, to those around him, like passivity. To understand Saladin's rise, you have to first understand the political landscape he was rising through, because it was a landscape defined by a process that had been building for half a century. After the First Crusade, the Islamic world surrounding the Crusader states had been fragmented, divided between the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the Zengid rulers of Mosul and Aleppo, the various emirs and atabegs of Syria, and half a dozen other competing powers who mistrusted each other, at least as much as they mistrusted the Crusaders. This fragmentation had been, for the Crusader states, an essential condition of survival. A united Islamic world was something the Kingdom of Jerusalem could not have withstood. A divided one was something it could, with difficulty and diplomacy and occasional military brilliance, manage. The process of Islamic reunification began in earnest with Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul, who in 1144 captured Edessa, the first of the Crusader states to fall. Its loss provoking the catastrophically mismanaged Second Crusade of 1147 to 1149, which accomplished essentially nothing and managed, in the process, to alienate the Kingdom of Jerusalem's most useful potential local ally, the ruler of Damascus. Zengi was a harsh and effective ruler who unified northern Syria under his control and demonstrated that the Crusader position was not, as it might have begun to seem, permanent. His son Nur ad-Din continued the work with greater sophistication. Where Zengi had been primarily a military operator, Nur ad-Din was also a political and religious one, investing heavily in religious institutions, cultivating the support of the ulama, framing the struggle against the Crusaders in explicitly jihadi terms that gave the conflict a moral and spiritual weight it had previously lacked in Islamic political discourse. He extended Zengid control southward into Syria, took Damascus, and began probing toward Egypt, where the Fatimid Caliphate was in advanced decline, its court riven by factional violence, and its military increasingly dependent on outside assistance. It was into Egypt that Nur ad-Din sent his general Shirkuh, and with Shirkuh, his young nephew Saladin. The Egyptian campaign of the 1160s is a fascinating piece of political theatre in which the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Zengid rulers of Syria competed to control the dying Fatimid Caliphate, each side intervening with military force in support of different Fatimid factions, each side maneuvering to prevent the other from gaining control of Egypt's enormous resources. Saladin served as a subordinate commander in his uncle's army during these campaigns, and the accounts suggest that he distinguished himself, militarily capable, politically astute, and possessed of a personal manner that generated loyalty in the people around him. When Shirkuh died in 1169, just months after finally securing control of Egypt, Saladin succeeded him as vizier of the Fatimid court. He was approximately 32 years old. He controlled Egypt, and he moved with a deliberateness that his contemporaries found variously admirable and alarming. Within 2 years, he had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, ending 2 centuries of Shia rule in Egypt and returning the country to Sunni Islam under nominal Abbasid authority. He built new religious institutions, reorganized the military, and began replacing Fatimid soldiers with troops loyal to himself. He was building not just a position, but a base, the resource foundation from which everything that followed would be launched. Nur ad-Din in Syria watched all of this with growing unease. Saladin was nominally his subordinate. He was behaving increasingly like an independent ruler. The relationship between them was deteriorating toward open confrontation when, in 1174, Nur ad-Din died, leaving a young son and a power vacuum that Saladin moved to fill with a speed that left observers uncertain whether to call it opportunism or statesmanship. Probably, as with most things Saladin did, it was both. Over the following decade, Saladin unified Egypt and Syria under his own rule, then extended his control to Mesopotamia, essentially surrounding the Crusader states on every side. It was a process accomplished through a combination of military force, strategic marriages, political negotiation, and the careful cultivation of a reputation for personal virtue and Islamic piety that made him difficult for other Muslim rulers to oppose without appearing to oppose Islam itself. This last point deserves emphasis. Saladin was, by the accounts of contemporaries on both sides, a man of genuine personal piety and remarkable consistency of character. He was known for his generosity. He gave away money with a liberality that repeatedly alarmed his treasurers and that his biographers record with admiring disbelief. He was known for his treatment of enemies, for a restraint and mercy that stood in pointed contrast to the conduct of many rulers of his era. He was known for keeping his word. These qualities were not merely personal virtues. They were political tools of the highest order, and Saladin understood their value with complete clarity. A ruler known for mercy could demand surrender from cities that might otherwise fight to the last. A ruler known for keeping his word could negotiate agreements that held. A ruler known for Islamic piety could call for jihad and be believed. By 1187, Saladin controlled more of the surrounding region than any Muslim ruler since the early caliphs. The Crusader states were an enclave, better fortified than ever, still militarily capable, but surrounded on every side by a unified power with vastly greater resources and a ruler who had been patient for 20 years and was now ready. He needed a reason, or rather, he had been given one. Reynaud of Chatillon was, by the consensus of virtually every historian who has studied him, exactly the kind of man that fragile diplomatic balances cannot survive. Lord of the great desert castle of Kerak, positioned on the trade routes between Egypt and Syria, Reynaud had a history of spectacular violence. He had once, in an earlier career in Antioch, tortured the patriarch of the city by covering his head in honey and leaving him on a rooftop in summer to be tormented by insects, which gives some indication of his general approach to human relationships. He had been captured by Nur ad-Din, and spent 15 years in a Syrian prison, emerging apparently unmodified by the experience. In 1186 and 1187, Reynold attacked Muslim caravans traveling under truce guarantees that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had issued and that represented the diplomatic framework allowing commerce and some degree of coexistence to continue. When Saladin demanded reparations and the release of prisoners, Reynold refused. King Guy of Jerusalem, a weak ruler who had come to power through a contested succession and who was unable or unwilling to control his most powerful vassals, did nothing effective. Saladin declared jihad and began to move. The Battle of Hattin, fought on July 4, 1187, was not so much a battle as it was the conclusion of a trap that Saladin had been constructing for weeks. He had lured the Crusader army out of its fortified positions by threatening Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. The strategic debate in the Crusader Council about whether to march to Tiberias's relief, with Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was in the city, arguing with cold strategic clarity that they should not, and the majority overruling him, was itself a kind of defeat before a single blow had been struck. The Crusader army that marched on July 3rd was large, perhaps 15 to 20,000 men, including the bulk of the kingdom's military strength. It marched in summer heat, across waterless terrain, toward a lake it never reached. Saladin's forces harassed the column continuously, cutting it off from water, setting fire to the dry grass around it, maintaining a pressure that was relentless without ever forcing the pitched engagement that the Crusader heavy cavalry might have turned to its advantage. By the morning of July 4th, the army had stopped on a plateau near the twin peaks called the Horns of Hattin. It was out of water. Its infantry was disintegrating from thirst and despair, and Saladin's army surrounded it on every side. The battle that followed was systematic destruction. The infantry collapsed and was largely killed or captured. The cavalry fought in desperate charges that Saladin's forces absorbed and contained. The true cross, the relic that the army carried into battle as its most sacred object, believed to be a fragment of the cross of the crucifixion itself, was captured. King Guy was taken prisoner. Reynold of Chatillon was brought before Saladin, who offered Guy water as a gesture of mercy, the ancient custom that guaranteed a captive's life, and then turned to Reynold and killed him personally. The man who had broken the truce would not receive the protection of the truce. The fighting men of the kingdom were dead or in chains. The fortresses that had seemed so permanent stood empty of defenders, and Saladin moved from city to city through the following weeks, receiving surrenders with a courtesy that the populations he accepted could scarcely believe after what they had heard of war. Jerusalem surrendered on October 2nd, 1187. Saladin allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves and leave. There was no massacre. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not destroyed. The city, which had been taken from its Muslim inhabitants 88 years earlier in rivers of blood, was retaken in something that looked, by the standards of the age, almost like peace. The news, when it reached Europe, struck like a physical blow. And in the courts of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, 3 kings began, separately and reluctantly and with mutual suspicion already building, to think about what they were going to do about it. When the news of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem reached Europe in the autumn of 1187, it arrived with the particular force that only the loss of something long taken for granted can produce. For 88 years, Jerusalem had been Christian. A generation had grown up knowing it as a Christian city, assuming it would remain one, building an entire architecture of theological and political identity around that assumption. The Crusader states had become, in the European imagination, not an experiment but a permanence, a sacred constant at the eastern edge of the world. And now, in the space of a single catastrophic summer, it was gone. Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull Auditor Tremendi. That interpreted the disaster in the terms available to a medieval churchman. It was God's punishment for the sins of the Christian people, and the appropriate response was repentance, reform, and another crusade. The response across Europe was, initially at least, genuine and widespread. Three of the most powerful rulers in Christendom took the cross within months of each other. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, perhaps the most formidable ruler in Europe. Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, methodical and cold and possessed of a political intelligence that never rested. And Henry II of England. Henry died before he could fulfill his vow. His son succeeded him. And it is with that son, Henry's brilliant, restless, difficult, magnificent son, that the Third Crusade truly begins. Richard I of England is one of those historical figures whose reputation has been so thoroughly processed by centuries of storytelling that finding the actual man underneath requires a certain determined excavation. The legend is familiar. Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king, brave beyond measure, chivalric in the truest sense, the perfect embodiment of medieval martial virtue. The reality is considerably more interesting than the legend and, in some ways, considerably less flattering. Richard spent approximately 10 months of his entire 10-year reign in England. He spoke French as his primary language and regarded England primarily as a source of revenue for his military campaigns. He was, without question, a military commander of exceptional ability. His contemporaries, friends, and enemies alike acknowledged this with a consistency that makes the assessment reliable. He was also autocratic, financially rapacious, politically impulsive, and possessed of a temper that occasionally overrode his considerable strategic intelligence at exactly the wrong moments. He was 31 years old when he took the cross. He was energetic, physically imposing, and absolutely serious about the crusade in a way that his eventual co-commander Philip Augustus manifestly was not. He spent the months before departure reorganizing English administration, raising money by methods that his contemporaries found impressive and alarming in roughly equal measure. He was reported to have said he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer, and assembling a fleet and army of genuine quality, he set off in 1190. And almost immediately, the campaign began accumulating the complications that would define it. Frederick Barbarossa, leading the largest of the three armies overland through Anatolia, drowned crossing the Salef River in June of 1190. An absurd, undignified end for the greatest ruler in Europe, and a catastrophe for the crusade. His army, deprived of its commanding personality, largely dissolved. Some reached the Holy Land. Most went home. The land route through Anatolia, which had been counted on to deliver an enormous German force, contributed almost nothing to what followed. Philip and Richard, traveling by sea, stopped at Sicily, where Richard became entangled in a dispute over his sister's dowry that consumed the winter of 1190 to 1191, in negotiations that were expensive, time-consuming, and entirely characteristic of his inability to let any perceived injustice pass unanswered. Philip sailed ahead. Richard stopped again at Cyprus, whose Byzantine ruler made the mistake of treating Richard's shipwrecked fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, with insufficient hospitality. Richard, with a speed that must have been startling, conquered the entire island in approximately 3 weeks, sold it to the Knights Templar, and sailed on. He arrived at Acre in June of 1191 to find a siege already in progress. The remnant Crusader forces, led by the tenacious Guy of Lusignan, had been besieging the city for nearly 2 years, while Saladin's army besieged the besiegers from outside. It was a military arrangement of remarkable complexity and remarkable suffering on all sides. Richard's arrival, with his fleet and his fresh troops and his siege equipment, broke the deadlock. Acre fell on July 12, 1191, after a siege that had consumed an almost incomprehensible quantity of human life on both sides. The terms of surrender included the release of Christian prisoners, the return of the True Cross, and a ransom payment for the city's garrison. What happened next remains one of the most debated and condemned acts of the Third Crusade. When the agreed terms were not fulfilled by Saladin within the specified time, the negotiations over the True Cross and the prisoner exchange stalled in a tangle of mutual suspicion and logistical difficulty. Richard ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners held outside the city walls. It was done in view of Saladin's army. Saladin, watching from the hills, was unable to intervene in time and subsequently executed his own Christian prisoners in response. Historians have debated Richard's decision ever since, whether it was a calculated military choice to prevent the burden of guarding prisoners during his coming march south, whether it was a loss of temper, whether it was a negotiating tactic that went too far. What it was not, by any standard, was chivalric, in the sense the legend would prefer. It was a massacre of prisoners who had surrendered on specific terms, and it cast a shadow over Richard's reputation that his subsequent military brilliance could partially obscure but never fully remove. The march south from Acre to Jaffa, conducted through August of 1191, is the episode that military historians most consistently hold up as evidence of Richard's genuine tactical genius. Saladin harassed the column continuously. The same strategy of mobile harassment that had destroyed the Crusader army on the road to Hattin 4 years earlier. Richard's response was a feat of discipline and organization that remains remarkable even at this distance. He kept his army in tight formation, the infantry on the landward side absorbing arrow fire while the cavalry marched protected on the seaward side, the fleet moving parallel along the coast providing supply and flank protection. He forbade retaliatory charges, the instinct of every knight in the column, insisting on formation integrity with a firmness that must have required enormous personal authority to maintain. The Battle of Arsuf, fought on September 7th, 1191, came when Saladin's pressure finally forced an engagement. The Hospitallers, stationed at the rear of the column and absorbing the worst of the harassment, broke formation and charged despite Richard's orders. Richard, displaying the flexibility of a truly gifted commander, turned the unauthorized charge into a coordinated assault with a speed that converted what might have been a disaster into a genuine victory. Saladin's forces withdrew. The road to Jaffa was clear, and here the Third Crusade reached the moment that would define it. Not a battle, but a series of councils, retreats, and agonizing decisions that reveal more about the reality of medieval military campaigning than any of the fighting. Richard marched toward Jerusalem twice. He got within 12 miles of the city, close enough that, according to the chronicles, he raised his shield to block his own view of the walls, because he did not feel worthy to look upon a city he could not take, and twice he turned back. The reasons were strategic and entirely sound. Jerusalem could be taken, probably, but Jerusalem without the logistical infrastructure to hold it, surrounded by Saladin's intact field army, would be a trap rather than a prize. The city that had taken the First Crusade 3 years of campaigning to reach could be lost in an afternoon if the relieving army were destroyed outside its walls. The same calculus that had undone the Kingdom of Jerusalem at Hattin would simply be repeated, this time with Richard's army as the victim. His military council agreed with him. His soldiers, pilgrims who had traveled thousands of miles to see the Holy Sepulchre, did not. The tension between strategic reality and human longing runs through the chronicles of these months like a fracture line. Every account sensing the tragedy of the gap between what was achievable and what was desired. What makes the Third Crusade something more than simply another military campaign? What gives it the particular quality that has made it endure in the imagination is the relationship between its two principal figures. Richard and Saladin never met in person. This is a fact that the Romantic tradition has consistently refused to accept. and has repeatedly worked around with invented encounters that the historical record does not support, but they communicated through envoys, through gifts, through the elaborate courtesy that medieval warfare between honorable enemies sometimes produced. And what emerged from those communications was something that both sides recognized as remarkable. Saladin sent fruit and ice to Richard when the English king fell ill. Richard, at one point, requested that Saladin send a physician. Saladin did. The two men exchanged views on the nature of kingship, on the obligations of rulers, on the meaning of the city they were both fighting for. When Richard's horse was killed under him in battle, Saladin sent him a replacement. During the fighting, across the lines, as a gesture that both men understood as a statement about what kind of men they were. The chivalry between them was not, it should be said, unlimited. They were trying to kill each other's soldiers throughout these exchanges. The courtesy sat alongside the violence without apparent contradiction, which tells us something important about the medieval conception of honorable enmity. The idea that you could respect an opponent completely and still be entirely committed to his defeat. The war ended not with a decisive battle, but with a treaty. The Peace of Jaffa, signed in September of 1192, was a document of practical compromise that satisfied almost no one completely. Saladin retained Jerusalem. The Crusaders retained their coastal strip. Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe access to the holy sites. Both sides agreed to a 3-year truce. Richard sailed home in October of 1192, famously captured by the Duke of Austria on his return journey and held for ransom. An adventure that belongs to a different story, though it is very much in keeping with the general character of his life, which seemed constitutionally incapable of the uncomplicated. Saladin survived the treaty by less than 6 months. He died in Damascus in March of 1193, aged approximately 55, having given away so much of his wealth over his lifetime that his treasury at death contained barely enough to cover the cost of his funeral. His biographer Bahar ad-Din, who was present, records that his face in death was peaceful. He had spent his life building toward Jerusalem. He had taken it, held it, and defended it, and he had done it in a manner that his enemies, the people who had most reason to hate him, could not help but find themselves admiring. That combination, the achievement and the manner of it together, is why his name survived when so many others faded. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The crusading movement did not end. It would not end for another century, but something had shifted quietly and permanently in the balance of the contest. The days when a Western army could march to the Holy Land and take it through sheer determined violence were over. The world had reorganized itself around the effort to prevent exactly that. What came next was stranger, in some ways, than anything that had come before. There is a particular kind of institutional decay that does not announce itself with a single dramatic collapse, but reveals itself instead through a series of decisions that, taken individually, each seem to follow some kind of logic, and that taken together describe a movement losing its grip on its own original purpose. The century that followed the Third Crusade was, for the crusading movement, exactly that kind of decay. The idea remained, the infrastructure remained, the military orders, the papal machinery, the networks of taxation and recruitment that had learned, over a century of practice, how to raise and move large bodies of armed men toward the eastern Mediterranean. The rhetoric remained, as powerful and as emotionally compelling as it had ever been. What eroded, slowly and then with gathering speed, was the coherence between the stated purpose and the actual conduct of the campaigns. The gap between what the Crusades were supposed to be and what they were becoming widened with each successive expedition until, by the middle of the 13th century, it had become something that contemporaries themselves could see and name and find troubling. It opened most catastrophically, most irreversibly, in 1204. And it opened not in the deserts of Palestine, but in the streets of the most magnificent Christian city in the world. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to go to Egypt. This was the strategic logic that had been developing since the Third Crusade's failure to retake Jerusalem. The recognition that the key to the Holy Land was not a direct assault on Jerusalem itself, but the neutralization of Egypt, which under Saladin's successors, the Ayyubid dynasty, remained the primary power base of Islamic resistance to the Crusaders. Take Egypt, control the Nile, and Jerusalem would follow. It was a sound strategic concept that would be attempted in various forms for the better part of a century. The army that assembled in Venice in 1202 under the aging but formidably shrewd Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man reportedly in his 90s and nearly blind, who would prove to have more energy and more ruthlessness than men half his age, found itself immediately in a financial crisis. The Crusaders had contracted with Venice for transport and supplies calculated on an expected force of 33,000 men. The force that actually arrived was considerably smaller, and the shortfall in payment was enormous. Venice had built the ships. Venice had prepared the provisions. Venice intended to be paid. The solution that emerged from these negotiations was the first of the Fourth Crusade's remarkable detours. The Venetians proposed that the Crusaders could work off part of their debt by helping Venice recapture the port city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city that had recently come under Hungarian control. Pope Innocent III, when informed of this plan, wrote in explicit terms forbidding it. The Crusaders attacked Zara anyway. Innocent excommunicated the entire army. The army kept going. What happened next unfolded through a series of decisions that each had their own internal logic, and that together produced an outcome so far from the original intention that it reads, at this distance, almost like a dark comedy of institutional failure. A young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived at the Crusader camp with a proposition. His father, the legitimate Byzantine emperor, had been deposed and blinded by a usurper. If the Crusaders would restore his father to the throne of Constantinople, Alexios promised them, among other things, the submission of the Eastern Church to Rome, military and financial support for the continuation of the crusade, and the resolution of their Venetian debt. For the Venetians, who had their own long-standing commercial grievances against Byzantium, the opportunity was additionally attractive for reasons that had nothing to do with the Holy Land whatsoever. The decision to divert to Constantinople was not, in the immediate moment, obviously insane. Restoring a legitimate emperor to a friendly throne, securing Byzantine support, resolving the financial crisis. These were real goals with real strategic value. Innocent III opposed the diversion. He was, again, ignored. Constantinople in 1203 was still, despite centuries of gradual decline from its peak, one of the most extraordinary cities in the world. Its walls had never been successfully breached by an external enemy. Its wealth was legendary. The Crusaders who arrived in the Bosphorus and looked across the water at its skyline, the great dome of the Hagia Sophia visible from the sea, the palaces, the forums, the columns, the accumulated artistic treasure of 9 centuries of Roman and Byzantine civilization, were struck, the chronicles tell us, with something approaching awe. The initial campaign went, improbably, according to plan. The usurper fled. The legitimate emperor was restored. Young Alexios was crowned co-emperor alongside his father, and then, with a swiftness that should perhaps not have surprised anyone who understood Byzantine politics, the promises that had seemed so generous in a Venetian harbor proved, in the actual conditions of Constantinople, impossible to keep. The Byzantine population had not been consulted on the arrangements their new emperor had made. The promised submission of the Eastern Church to Rome was an arrangement that the Eastern clergy found theologically unacceptable and politically humiliating. The financial promises required revenues the Byzantine state did not possess. Tensions between the Crusaders camped outside the city and the population inside it mounted through the winter of 1203 to 1204, punctuated by riots and a fire that destroyed a significant portion of the city. In January of 1204, Alexios was strangled by a Byzantine noble named Murtzouphlos, who seized the throne and immediately repudiated all the agreements his predecessor had made. The Crusaders, camped outside Constantinople in the middle of winter, out of money, out of supplies, watching the smoke of the fires that had already damaged the city rising into the cold air, made their decision. They would take Constantinople for themselves. The sack of Constantinople in April of 1004 lasted 3 days, and it was an act of destruction so thorough, so comprehensive, and so irreversible that its consequences echoed through the next 2 centuries and arguably contributed to the final fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. The soldiers who broke through the walls were not barbarians in the sense of being culturally primitive or ignorant of what they were destroying. Many of them could recognize what they were looking at. That recognition did not slow them. Churches were stripped of their treasures. The great bronze horses that had stood for centuries in the Hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where they still stand above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica, the most visible surviving artifact of the sack, a permanent marker of what was taken. Relics by the hundreds, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, objects of incalculable devotional value, were looted and distributed across Western Europe. The Imperial Library, containing manuscripts that preserved ancient texts surviving nowhere else in the world, was largely destroyed. What the swords did not ruin, the fires did. Pope Innocent III's response, when the full news reached him, was one of the more striking papal documents of the medieval period. He wrote with genuine horror about what had been done. The violation of Christian sanctuaries, the rape, the murder, the theft. And then, in a move that tells you something important about the institutional pressures the papacy was always navigating, he subsequently accepted the new Latin Empire that the Crusaders established in Constantinople as a fait accompli and worked to incorporate it into the broader structure of Catholic Christendom. The Eastern and Western churches, already separated by the Great Schism of 1054, were now separated by something that went beyond theology. The Eastern Christian world would not forget what Western Christian soldiers had done to the greatest city of Christendom. That wound did not heal. If the Fourth Crusade represents the movement's moral collapse at the level of high politics and military command, the Children's Crusade of 1212 represents something different and in some ways more heartbreaking. The movement's hold on the popular imagination at its most raw and most tragic. The precise events of 1212 are genuinely difficult to reconstruct, the sources being fragmentary and contradictory in ways that suggest the contemporaries themselves were not entirely sure what they had witnessed. What seems to have happened, in broad outline, is this. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed to have received a letter from Christ instructing him to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. He gathered a following. Estimates range from a few thousand to tens of thousands, the upper figures almost certainly inflated, of young people and impoverished adults who believed, with the absolute conviction of those who have nothing to lose, that what armed knights and mighty kings had failed to accomplish, the pure faith of the innocent would achieve. The sea, Stephen reportedly promised, would part before them as it had parted before Moses. The sea did not part. A similar movement in Germany, led by a boy named Nicholas of Cologne, attempted to cross the Alps and reach a Mediterranean port. Many died in the mountains. Those who reached the sea found no miraculous parting waiting for them. Some were offered free passage to the Holy Land by merchants who subsequently sold them into slavery in North Africa. The Children's Crusade, if that is what it was, Some historians argue the word pueri, meaning children, was used to denote the poor generally rather than the young. Specifically, ended in dispersal, slavery, and death without a single blow struck in the Holy Land. What it represents is both the depth of the crusading impulse in popular culture and the absolute bankruptcy of the institutional movement in its failure to provide that impulse any safe or functional outlet. And then, in 1229, something happened that managed to outrage almost everyone on both sides, while achieving the thing that armies had spent decades and oceans of blood trying to accomplish. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, excommunicated by the Pope, at war with the papacy. A man whose personal religious beliefs were so heterodox that contemporaries whispered he was a secret atheist, arrived in the Holy Land and sat down with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, nephew of Saladin, and negotiated. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control for a period of 10 years, with specific provisions guaranteeing Muslim access to the Temple Mount and its mosques. No battle was fought, no siege was mounted. Frederick, who spoke Arabic and had been in diplomatic contact with al-Kamil for years, had simply talked his way into an agreement that military force had been unable to produce. The response was remarkable in its unanimity of disapproval. The Muslim religious establishment in Jerusalem protested bitterly that their sacred sites had been traded away by a sultan with no right to do so. The Christian Patriarch of Jerusalem placed the city under interdict the moment Frederick entered it, meaning that Frederick's triumphant arrival in Jerusalem was accompanied by the closure of every church in the city. The Knights Templar, who had not been consulted, sent word to al-Kamil, informing him of the best routes for an assassination attempt on the emperor. Frederick crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in a ceremony with no officiating clergyman willing to perform it, and departed for Europe shortly thereafter, pelted with offal by the citizens of Acre as he left. He had given the Crusaders what they wanted. They could not forgive him for the way he had gotten it. Jerusalem would remain in Christian hands for another 15 years before falling again, this time permanently, to a force of Khwarezmian mercenaries in 1244. The diplomatic achievement that had scandalized two religions dissolved back into the desert as though it had never been. The age of the Great Crusades was drawing toward its close, and in the chronicles and the counting houses and the papal chanceries of Europe, the first quiet, uncomfortable questions were beginning to be asked about whether the whole enterprise had been, in the end, worth the cost. Every great historical movement has a moment when it ends not with the dramatic finality of a last stand, but with the quieter, more complicated recognition that what sustained it, the belief, the momentum, the sense that the effort was still worth making, has finally and irreversibly run out. For the Crusades, that moment came slowly. It came in pieces. It came through the accumulation of failed campaigns and broken promises and expeditions that sailed with enormous hope and returned with almost nothing to show for the cost. And it came, with a terrible literalness, on the morning of May 18th, 1291, outside the walls of the last great Crusader city on the eastern Mediterranean coast. But before we reach that morning, we have to sit with the decades that produced it. Because the end of the Crusades is not simply a military story. It is a story about exhaustion. The exhaustion of resources, of political will, of the imaginative capacity to believe that one more expedition, one more sacrifice, one more army marching east, would finally settle what all the previous ones had not. The 13th century, after Frederick II's strange diplomatic interlude, was a century of diminishing returns. Louis IX of France, Saint Louis, as he would eventually be canonized, launched 2 crusades with a sincerity and personal devotion that no one who encountered him doubted for a moment. He was, by all accounts, a man of genuine holiness and considerable political intelligence, and the combination made him the most respected monarch in Europe and one of the most tragic figures in the later history of the movement. His first crusade, the seventh, aimed at Egypt in the now established strategic logic that controlling the Nile was the key to controlling Jerusalem. He landed at Damietta in 1249 with a well-organized, well-supplied army and took the city with relative ease. Then he advanced toward Cairo. And the campaign that had seemed so promising encountered the Nile, specifically the annual flooding of the Nile, which turned the delta into a landscape of mud and water channels that his army could neither navigate nor escape. Disease swept through his ranks. His supply lines were cut. At the Battle of Al-Mansura, his advance guard was drawn into the city streets in a classic ambush and destroyed, his brother killed in the fighting. The army that had come to Egypt with such confidence was reduced, by the spring of 1250, to a column of sick and starving men trying to retreat to Damietta. Louis himself fell ill with dysentery so severe that the chronicles record this detail with a plainness that is somehow more affecting than any dramatic flourish. His attendants cut away the seat of his clothing rather than delay the column's movement. He was captured along with most of his army. He was ransomed for an enormous sum. He spent 4 more years in the Holy Land, doing what he could to strengthen the remaining Crusader fortifications, before returning to France in 1254. He went back, 17 years later, in 1270, already ill, already aging. He led another crusade, the 8th, this time directed at Tunis, for reasons that historians have debated ever since without reaching a fully satisfying consensus. He died of disease outside the walls of Tunis before any significant military action had been taken. He died, the accounts say, with the word Jerusalem on his lips. He never reached it. He never came close, and his death outside Tunis stands as a kind of summary of the later crusading enterprise. The faith entirely genuine, the devotion entirely real, and the gap between those things and what could actually be accomplished in the world growing wider with each passing year. While the great crusades were failing and retreating and dying of disease in Egyptian deltas and North African beaches, the world surrounding the remaining Crusader states was undergoing a transformation more radical than anything the Islamic political reorganization of Saladin's era had produced. From the steppes of Central Asia, the Mongols had arrived. The Mongol conquests of the mid-13th century reshaped the political map of the known world with a speed and violence that left contemporaries reaching for apocalyptic language, because no other vocabulary seemed adequate. Baghdad fell to Hulagu Khan in 1258. The Abbasid Caliph, the symbolic center of Sunni Islam, was executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, so that his blood would not touch the ground. The great city that had been the capital of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries was sacked so thoroughly that the waters of the Tigris ran black with the ink of the books thrown into the river from its libraries. The Crusader states, watching all of this from their coastal strip, faced a genuinely difficult strategic question. Were the Mongols potential allies against the Islamic powers that had been squeezing them for 2 centuries, or were they simply a new and more terrifying version of the same threat? There were Nestorian Christians in the Mongol ruling class. There were diplomatic contacts. There were dreams, in some Western quarters, of a great Christian-Mongol alliance that would finally crush Islamic power between 2 forces. Those dreams came to nothing. The Mongols were stopped at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 by the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, a military slave dynasty that had seized power from the Ayyubids in the chaos following Louis IX's First Crusade, and that proved, in the event, to be the most formidable military power the Crusader states had yet faced. The Mamluks had defeated the Mongols. The Mamluks were now turning their full attention to the remaining Crusader presence on their northern flank, under their Sultan Baybars, and then under Kolawun, and then under Kolawun's son Al-Ashraf Khalil. The Mamluks proceeded to dismantle the Crusader states with a methodical patience that had something almost administrative about it. Caesarea fell, Arsuf fell, Safed fell, Jaffa fell, Antioch fell in 11268, ending the Crusader presence in northern Syria after 170 years. The great Hospitaller fortress of Crac des Chevaliers, which had withstood every previous assault, fell in 1271, reportedly after Baybars forged a letter from the Hospitaller command ordering the garrison to surrender, a piece of deception so elegant that it seems almost to deserve the admiration it has received. The Crusader states were reduced to a narrow coastal strip, then to a handful of cities, then, essentially, to Acre. Acre in the late 13th century was one of the busiest and most cosmopolitan ports in the Mediterranean world. Its streets held merchants from every Christian nation in Europe, alongside the local communities that had been there since before the Crusaders arrived. The military orders maintained their headquarters there. The remaining nobility of the Crusader kingdom conducted their politics there, with the same factionalism and paralysis that had characterized the kingdom's governance for 2 centuries, unchanged and unchastened by the catastrophes those habits had produced. In 1289, Tripoli fell. The last significant Crusader possession outside Acre was gone. The city that remained understood, with a clarity that the chronicles make no attempt to soften, what was coming. Al-Ashraf Khalil, Sultan of Egypt, arrived before the walls of Acre on April 5, 1291, with an army that contemporary estimates put in the tens of thousands, a force so large that the Crusader defenders, numbering perhaps 15,000 in total, including every able-bodied man who could be armed, had no plausible path to resistance. What they had was walls that were genuinely formidable and the knowledge that no relief force was coming. Europe knew Acre was under threat. The response was a trickle, a small force of poorly disciplined Italian crusaders who arrived in 1290 and promptly massacred a group of Muslim merchants in the city, giving Khalil's forces the pretext for what was already inevitable. Beyond that, nothing. The kingdoms of Europe were occupied with each other. The crusading movement that had once sent 100,000 men eastward could not, in 1291, produce the army that might have saved its last city. The siege lasted 6 weeks. It was, by the accounts of those present, an experience of sustained and total bombardment. The Mamluk army brought an artillery train of siege engines so extensive that the sound of them, according to the chronicle of the Templar of Tyre, was like continuous thunder that did not stop for days. The walls were broken. The towers fell one by one. On May 18, 1291, the Mamluk army entered Acre. What followed was the fall of a city in the medieval sense, the complete, final destruction of what it had been. The population that could flee did, mostly by sea, in a desperate scramble that the accounts describe with a particularity of suffering that resists easy summary. Many did not make it. The Templars held their great tower for 10 more days after the city fell before the structure collapsed, killing, the accounts say, both the remaining defenders and the Mamluk soldiers who had been tunneling beneath it. The remaining Crusader positions, Sidon, Beirut, the island fortresses, were evacuated in the weeks that followed. By the summer of 1291, 200 years of Crusader presence in the Holy Land was over, not reduced, not weakened, over. The last Latin Christian soldier had left the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. The sea that had carried so many armadas east carried only refugees home. What did the Crusades leave behind? It is a question that has been generating answers for 7 centuries. And the answers have varied enormously, depending on who is asking, when, and why. At the most concrete level, they left architecture, the castles that still stand on the ridgelines of Lebanon and Syria, the Crusader churches in Jerusalem and Cyprus that are still, in some cases, in use. They left the military orders, transformed and relocated, but in several instances surviving into the modern world. They left commercial networks that had deepened the integration of European and Mediterranean economies in ways that outlasted the political structures that created them. They left, less visibly but no less permanently, a set of transfers, of knowledge, of texts, of agricultural products, of technologies, that flowed in both directions across the contact zones the Crusades created. Sugar cultivation in Cyprus, medical knowledge preserved in Arabic and reintroduced to Europe through Crusader contact points, architectural techniques that moved west in the minds of returning builders. The windmill, possibly. The pointed arch, probably already known but reinforced by contact with Islamic architecture. These transfers were not the purpose of the Crusades, and most of the people involved in them were barely aware of what was moving. But they moved nonetheless, as things always do when cultures collide in sustained and intimate proximity. They left, most durably and most painfully, a legacy in human memory. The Crusades entered the memory of the Islamic world as a wound, not an immediately fatal one because the Islamic world recovered and ultimately prevailed, but a wound nonetheless, with the particular quality of wounds inflicted by those who believed they were doing good while inflicting them. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099, the massacre of Acre, the destruction of communities and the appropriation of lands justified by the language of holy purpose. These things were remembered, and the memory did not fade, and it was available across the following centuries to be invoked, instrumentalized, and transformed by whoever found it useful. They left, in European memory, something more complicated, a myth of noble failure, of sacrifice for a transcendent cause, of the possibility that the gap between the world as it is and the world as faith insists it should be, might be bridged by sufficient will and sufficient courage. This myth was never quite accurate, even at the time, but it was persistent, and it attached itself to subsequent enterprises, colonial, nationalist, ideological, in ways that the men who marched barefoot to Jerusalem in 1099 could not have imagined and would not, one suspects, have endorsed. The Crusades were not, in the end, a story about what religion can make people do. Though they were that, they were not simply a story about what power and money and land hunger can do when dressed in the language of the sacred. Though they were that too, they were, most essentially, a story about human longing. The longing for something pure in a world that resists purity. The longing for a place where the distance between the human and the divine collapses entirely, where the sacred is not merely believed in but walked upon, touched, defended. Jerusalem was real, and Jerusalem was a symbol simultaneously. And the 2-century effort to possess it was driven by both of those things in proportions that varied with every individual who took the cross. Most of them never came home. Of those who did, most came home changed by what they had seen, by what they had done, by the distance they had traveled in every sense of that word. The city they had fought for still stands. It is still contested. It is still, after everything, the place where 3 of the world's great religions locate something essential about their understanding of the sacred and the human and the relationship between them. In that sense, nothing has been settled. The account that the Crusaders thought they were going to Jerusalem to settle remains, 7 centuries later, open. Perhaps it always will. Some cities are like that. Some questions are like that. And perhaps that is, in its own quiet way, worth sitting with.